Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's having at least a little bit of a chance to enjoy the beautiful weather we're having. Looks like spring is upon us. What is generally known as a time for rebirth and fresh starts. And in corresponding with that concept, April is also Second Chance Month, which is a designation given to it by the United States Department of Justice to raise awareness about safe and successful integration into the community for more than 650,000 people released from prisons each year. Now, nearly 4,000 of those people are incarcerated in South Dakota prisons, with another 3,000 on probation or parole. South Dakota is home to 8 Department of Corrections facilities, and all but one of them are well beyond capacity, with one facility being at 235% above capacity. And the average of all 8 facilities is 133% above capacity. 98% of those who reside in these facilities will eventually return to the community. But what awaits them? And what prepares them to reenter society? What can we do? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm very, very fortunate to be able to welcome a couple of very, very well qualified scholars for this discussion. I have Dr. Jenna Borseth and Dr. Lucas Wiscons, and I will let them introduce themselves. Jenna, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, sure. I'm Jenna Borseth. I am an assistant professor at the University of South Dakota. So I've been here, I believe this is the end of my 4th year, and I teach most of our corrections classes. So prisons and penology, community corrections, intro to corrections, all within my wheelhouse. And then when it comes to research, I predominantly do programmatic assessments of correctional programs, whether those are community services we offer, like drug courts, halfway houses, or prison programs that get offered. So, me.
Great.
Thank
And
you.
my name is Lucas Wiscons. I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice at Northern State University. This is my first year here. I'm new to South Dakota, new to Aberdeen, loving it so far. How could I not with the beautiful weather out here? I also teach art classes here on corrections, community corrections, prisons and penology. I also teach classes on mental health and criminal justice, and classes on immigration and incarceration as well. My research has predominantly been on policing and police record keeping, and interactions between police and people on the autism spectrum in particular. But I broadly am interested in criminal justice issues, and I'm happy to be here with you all today. So thank you.
And we are definitely happy to have you. So let's start with the nitty gritty, the statistics. Nationally, internationally, the research I have found says 1 out of 5 prisoners in the world is incarcerated in the United States. Does that sound right? I mean, accurate. I should say, does it sound accurate?
Yeah, that's pretty close to accurate. We've seen a minor sort of reduction in sort of incarceration rates in the United States, but we're still world champions in terms of putting people in penal institutions.
It's not really where we want to be number 1, huh? But
Yeah.
you know, and according to the Prison Policy Institute, we have the highest rate in the world, like you said. 614 people are incarcerated for every 100,000 people in the population. The UK is second at 144. I mean, we're not just winning; we are like lapping everybody on this track because
Yeah.
we are way ahead of the curve. Now, South Dakota is not any better because South Dakota's incarceration rate comparatively, according to the statistics that I cited, was 824 per 100,000. Now, keep in mind that the national rate is 614. South Dakota is 824. So does that mean that we're leading the entire world in incarceration rates, or how does that compare?
Yes, we are, is the short answer to that question. We have some fierce competition with some other states, mostly in the South in the United States. But one of the questions I was saying before we started today, one of the questions I put on my midterm is who has a higher incarceration rate, South Dakota or Cuba? And it turns out South Dakota's incarceration rate is higher than Cuba, higher than Russia, some of these countries that we think of as authoritarian, and utilizing sort of punitive criminal justice. So we're world champions. We're in the top 10.
And what do you think what contributes to that? I know that South Dakota incarcerates a lot of nonviolent, low-level offenders, and it has like the numbers, the prison population has increased, I think, by 500% in the last 35 years. So in South Dakota. So what's going on?
I'm not sure. Do you want to start this one, Jenna? It's a big question.
It's a really big question. I think there's a lot that goes into it. So a couple of things is I think that not just in South Dakota, but in the United States as a whole, we see so much variability with what we want the criminal justice system to be. So I think you have this scheduled to talk about a little bit more in depth later on in the semester. But when we look at like how the prison system treats people and what its primary objectives are, and does it want to focus on rehabilitation or punishment, and what kind of rehabilitation, those trends last like 10, 15, 20 years before we decide, no, this isn't working, I want to change my mind. Even in like the federal administration, right? We've seen things happen now. Donald Trump last presidency, talked about criminal justice reform and put into place like the First Step Act. He talked about police reform and having agencies, federal law enforcement agencies track police misconduct. We're seeing some of those policies be reversed now. So we don't tend to stick with things for a long time. I think that's partially why we see high incarceration rates, because we're not actually following through with our ideas, where we're throwing it at the wall, and if it doesn't stick immediately, we just throw it in the garbage. I think there's also an ongoing public fear of crime that drives a lot of criminal justice policy. If you ask students, which I do in my class every semester, they think crime is rising. They think crime is worse now than it's ever been in a long time, and that it's this big problem that we need to solve. And in reality, crime just isn't rising. We've seen crime on a decline for many years now, with pockets of crime rising here and there, but on a general trend, it is going down. So I think those perceptions contribute to a lot of misleading policy as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I ask the same question. Students have the same perspective up here in Aberdeen, right? And they're surprised when they hear that things really sort of maxed out in the mid-90s. It's been 30 years really since we've had a substantial upward trend in terms of our crime rate. The other thing that I would add is that I think it would be fair to say that it is fair to say that our criminal justice system and our economic systems are deeply intertwined with one another, especially in terms of their origination. We'll talk about this a little bit later, I'm sure, but one of the major growths in terms of building correctional institutions, what are now known as correctional institutions in the United States, was actually as a way of directing labor, of capturing labor and making it available to, both in the North and the South, right, following the Civil War, make it available to individuals and landowners for the purposes of replacing slavery and fueling the Industrial Revolution. And those institutions, once they're entrenched, become really, really difficult to shrink in any meaningful capacity. We've seen it happen a little bit in the past decade and a half or so, but in terms of incarceration rates, things may be turning around. It's a little bit difficult to tell right now whether we're going up or down in terms of incarceration rates in the United States.
Well, and there was one thing that I found interesting too with, during COVID, when a lot of correctional institutions were letting people out because of just because of the situation. South Dakota didn't have any had zero COVID influence releases from March of 2020, I think, to December of 21. We were only one of 14 or so states that had zero releases. Does that also contribute to the fact that other states have lower prison populations than we do, or is that not really a significant factor in that?
So I'm not familiar with the specific statistics here in South Dakota, but overall, my understanding of the trends is that there was as COVID was sort of in its early stages, there was an effort to reduce prison and jail populations, especially jail populations and prison populations of sort of nonviolent and drug offenders. But as far as I've seen the statistics since then, and as a sociologist, we tend to need more than a few years to be able to analyze trends. It seems like things have really sort of returned to post-COVID levels in most places in terms of new incarceration. So you see this little drop right around COVID, but then pretty much everywhere, as far as I'm aware, things have really spiked back up sort of to be sort of on the trend line that they were prior to COVID.
Yeah, I thought it was strange when I was looking at it that, okay, we didn't have any COVID releases, but we actually went up 2.4% during COVID for incarcerations. And I thought,
Well, that's
that's
also a
kind of
caveat on
strange.
South Dakota, and this is something that maybe Jenna has a better sense of than I do, but it is true that nationally the crime rate has been falling since the mid 1990s. But in South Dakota, it's actually been rising slowly but surely. So we are sort of an exception in that regard, where overall crime has fallen actually quite substantially in the past few decades. In South Dakota, over that same period, it's risen steadily. So I'm not familiar. I don't know what the factors are that have contributed to that, but it's an interesting phenomenon at the very least.
Do you know if those are what types of crimes we're looking at with the increase up here in South Dakota?
So I'd have to look, but what has essentially happened is that the crime rates in South Dakota have historically been lower than crime rates in the rest of the country, right? And as crime rates have come down in the rest of the country, crime rates in South Dakota have come up a little bit, and they've sort of met, right? So now the crime rate in South Dakota is very similar to the crime rate in the country overall. But I don't know how that breaks down in terms of violent versus nonviolent crimes, for example, or drug-related offenses or things like that.
And I think it's worth mentioning too the disproportionate representation of minorities in our correctional facilities as opposed to their representation in the community.
Yeah.
I think the statistics I saw that like Native Americans are 8% of the population, but 35% of those incarcerated in South Dakota prisons, and African Americans are 2% of the South Dakota population, but 8% of the prison population. And that seems to be a nationwide trend, but even here in South Dakota, where let's face it, we don't have a whole lot of diversity to begin with, but the disproportionate representation in the criminal justice system, is there any research or literature or anything behind what causes that here?
Do you want to take this one first, Jenna? This is another really big question. I'm just punting the big questions over to you.
It's a really big question. I'm not familiar with any research about specifically here in South Dakota. One speculation that I would have, though, is that the lack of diversity in South Dakota might contribute to those higher rates because we don't have that exposure to people with different ideas and people with different religious backgrounds and complexions and all of those types of things. So that when we're confronted with it, it feels more jarring than if you're living in a community where you're around these people all the time and it's just a normal part of life. So I would wonder if that is part of it. Earlier, not to scapegoat the question entirely, I just wanted to go back. You mentioned earlier about the rise in South Dakota's population or prison population and crime rate. Part of what I would wonder about is we do know that South Dakota has fewer resources available for the general public. We have a very high unemployment rate, a very high poverty rate. And we do know some of those things, questionable education systems. We do know some of those things contribute to crime rate down the line. So it could be that some of these systemic issues that we have as a state are contributing to higher crime rates overall.
Okay, thank you. That helps clarify things a little bit. We'll move on. So a big part of incarceration rates too are related to recidivism. Dr. Wiscons, could you tell us what that is in a nutshell?
Sure. Recidivism is essentially after you have been released from whatever the sentence was from a previous crime, you find yourself reincarcerated, right? So this can happen through reoffending. So you commit a new crime, so you end up back in prison. But it can also happen, as I think we're going to discuss more during this meeting, if you're given something like a probation or parole sentence and you violate that community corrections, that can also lead to something called recidivism. But it's essentially being reincarcerated after you've served some sort of term of punishment.
Thank you. So nationwide, the statistics show that 43% of people released from state prisons reoffend within a year. In South Dakota, over 2,000 people are released from South Dakota prisons each year, and they come back into society. But 44% are rearrested within 3 years following release, which has gone up almost 40% since 2016. Why is that? What are the factors that, especially in South Dakota, but in general, that lead to recidivism?
Yeah. So I can start this one. It's another big, important question. And some of it I would call social structural, which is things like when you are released from prison, it can be very difficult for you to find a job, for example, because you now have a criminal record. It can be, you might have restrictions on whether or not you're able to access your family, your support systems, whether you're able to access housing. And then all of that, if you're on parole, if you're being supervised when you're back in the community, you now have sort of the criminal justice system following, tracking your every move. So even small mistakes can have big consequences for you at that stage. Just anecdotally, last night, actually, I was doing a ride along with the Aberdeen Police Department here. And one thing you'll notice if you ever do a ride along with the police is they know exactly who's on probation and parole in their community. They know who has a criminal history, and they're not just passively noticing them as they go throughout the community, they're looking for them. Right? So they're people who are exposed to increasing surveillance, people who have made mistakes before. Now there's increased pressure on them to be successful, and they're being surveilled in a way that the general population generally isn't. So there's this view of we need to be restrictive towards these people because they've done something wrong, so we need to supervise them more closely. But when you put that level of scrutiny and supervision onto someone who's already had some sort of difficulty, because crime is often the result of familial difficulty, addiction, mental health, housing problems, any of these components, if all you're doing is just looking at them more closely when you put them back into the community, it makes complete sense why they would be reincarcerated pretty swiftly after reentering the community. There are very few supports that are available in many places, not just South Dakota, but South Dakota. So we're not really doing a great job of setting people up for success when they reenter the community, and then we're surveilling them at a new heightened level. So that's just a recipe for recidivism.
Yeah, I've heard several people that I know, actually, former students of mine. I was a disciplinary supervisor here at Brookings High School, and I do have some former students who have been in the system, and they have said, once you have that label, you can't escape it. So you're set up, not in a literal sense, but it's difficult to succeed after that, because that's a shadow that you just can't escape.
Right.
Along with the finding a job, of course, is important in reintegration into society. But why is it that most reoffend? Is that why most reoffend within the first year? Just because it's so hard to find a job, and finding housing is difficult? Is that why?
I think that I agree with a lot of Dr. Wiscons' perspectives on the back end and the reintegration and a lot of those barriers. I think it's also important to acknowledge that when we take people and incarcerate them, they have protective factors in their life, even though they've been engaged in crime, that help them abstain from crime. These are things like family relationships, activities that are generally pro-social, work. And we actively disrupt those things when we incarcerate them. So by taking them out of society, we are innately sort of increasing their likelihood of reoffending. So it's up to the prison system to rehabilitate them and give them those skills back along with other skills so that they can successfully reintegrate. I don't think our prison systems are very effective in being able to do that. So I think that partially plays a role in why it's harder to come back, because we're disrupting those pro-social skills. We're not effectively giving you enough new skills to handle that reintegration. And then there's a bunch of social stigma when you get back into society that sort of bars you from getting jobs, from getting houses, from obtaining new friends, from establishing good relationships with your family members who you've fractured.
Yeah, the statistic that I read from the state of South Dakota DOC report for 2024 that said that the recidivism costs South Dakota almost $40 million. So this isn't just a minor issue. This is something that I think is worth really digging more into. So part of the recidivism rates is also attributable to a lack of education, right?
Sure. Yeah. Lack of access to educational opportunity is highly correlated. Absolutely.
So let's break these down a little bit. So we have the lack of education, the lack of housing and employment, which we just talked about. There's substance abuse issues, obviously. But the big two that I want to talk about, the first one is mental health issues. And I know, Dr. Wiscons, this is something that you have researched and that you teach about quite a bit. It's like, criminalization of mental illness, basically. Let's dig into that a little bit, if you don't mind. The
Sure.
Bureau of Justice report said about 2 in 5 people who are incarcerated have a history of mental illness, and which is twice the prevalence of mental illness within the overall population. However, 63% with this history do not receive mental health treatment while incarcerated in federal or state prison. And even when they get to prison, 50% of them don't get the medication they were taking before they got there. So can you break that down for us and make it understandable for us?
I will do my best. So I guess where to start with this, without going too far back, is that we have never dealt with mental health very well as a society. We used to institutionalize people, put them into mental health facilities, but those were not very effective, which is one of the reasons why we stopped using them. However, when we stopped using mental health facilities, we didn't replace them with something more effective. We essentially didn't replace them, so prisons and jails really came in and filled that void. So the largest mental health facilities, the largest psychiatric hospitals in the United States, the top 3 are all prisons, are all jails, actually, excuse me. The LA County Jail, the Cook County Jail, which is for the city of Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York. So those are the places that are the largest places in our country that are dealing with people who are in mental health crisis. Now, none of those places have the resources to deal with the level of mental health crisis that they encounter. So for example, Rikers Island, it's estimated they need about 3,300 beds at any given time to adequately address those who need those beds, and they have about 1,000. So if you end up in mental health crisis, and you end up at a jail, which is actually one of your best chances of getting access to a mental health professional or a psychiatrist, still your odds of actually getting the care you need are relatively low. So that's one of the dynamics that's going on here. The other pieces to this puzzle include that there's exactly one population of people in the United States who are constitutionally entitled to mental health care in the United States. And that is people who are incarcerated, people in jails and prisons. Now, that doesn't mean that they're getting adequate care, but the Supreme Court has said that the state has to provide some of that care to them. So a lot of people actually receive their diagnoses as part of being incarcerated. They enter the criminal justice system, they're screened for mental health, generally at a jail, not always, and sometimes they're referred to a psychologist, they get a diagnosis, they get their medication if things go right. And this all happens in the context of prisons and jails. Now, those people who are entering those systems, they're not going to stay there forever, right? So maybe they spend 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in jail or prison, and then they're released. And if they're lucky, they're given maybe a prescription for the medication they were given in jail and maybe a 2-week supply. And they're set loose into the community. And we shouldn't expect jails and prisons to be responsible for continuing the provision of mental health care once people are released from their custody. But what that means is that we need robust community mental health services available to those people to sort of help transition out of the carceral situation into the community. And in many places that just does not exist. So people re-enter the community. They may have their medication for a while. Even if they do have access to a supply, they may stop taking it because they're not receiving the other types of mental health care they need. They have some new mental health crisis. The way we respond to mental health crises in the United States is generally with the police. The police essentially have two options when they show up. If they're going to do anything, they're either going to take you to the emergency room or take you to jail. And so we just end up with this revolving door of people into and out of our carceral facilities, where the only place they're getting the care they need is actually while they're incarcerated. There are people who commit crimes. They seek to go to jail to gain access to their medication. This is something that is happening in the United States. So that's a piece of what's going on. But it is a dynamic that exists both here in our state, but also in the country more broadly.
Thank you for breaking that down. I know the other one, the fifth, I suppose, reason for incarceration, recidivism, excuse me, that really caught my attention was what they refer to as technical violations, and those are there's basically, it goes back to the 4 types of release, right? From what I was able to find, there's 4 types of release from incarceration in South Dakota. Suspended release, which is 3.8% of recidivists. Discretionary parole, 35.1% of recidivists. Presumptive parole, 55.2%, and sentence discharge, which is referred to as flat timing, is only about 5.8%. So South Dakota, from what I understand, is unique in our presumptive parole being, it's not just this is the date you're eligible for parole. Your presumptive parole date is the day you're going out on parole. If unless something happens, you're out that day. So the initial parole date isn't the date of eligibility for parole, but it's expected date of release. So when you think about the technical violations, then that the South Dakota Department of Corrections report indicated that most of the parole violations that people end up sending people back to prison in South Dakota are with like out of area, which means not checking in on time or a substance or alcohol abuse usage, something like that. 86% of recidivism is due to those types of things. Then there's also failure to participate in the required programs, failure to comply with imposed sanctions, drug violations, things like that. But excuse me, technical violations are the reason for 28% of the returns, which is higher than new convictions. So it seems to me from their own statistics that it's not necessarily the crime per se, new offenses, it's just getting caught up in the system like we talked about before. Does that sound right?
It definitely does. I think people tend to overestimate how easy probation and parole are. Just an anecdotal example, to give students a little bit of perspective. In one of my classes, all of my students are required to go on a mock probation. So for 2 months, they follow all of the basic standard conditions that South Dakota probationers are required to follow. Nearly half of my class fails. Everyone has an infraction. So, and I don't mean they fail the grade, they fail probation. They're not successful in adhering to those conditions. And a lot of it is like, yes, I got busy. I didn't have time to come to your office and check in for my probation meeting. Or I was talking to friends and we decided to go to Yankton to go to this fast food joint that we don't have here in Vermillion. And things like that are really minor. It's not causing any innate harm to society, but they are concerns from a supervision standpoint, and it creates probation officers' jobs a lot more difficult if we have repeats. Instances where people are doing very minor things, it is sort of the go-to to just like, how can we revoke this? You're not taking it seriously, you're not capable, those types of things. And not to circle the discussion all the way back, I think this is another thing that we see contribute to the racial bias in the system, is who is more likely to suffer from revocations because of these petty infractions? Minority citizens.
Yeah, one thing that can often happen as part of being on probation or parole is you can lose your access to drive. That's not a standard condition, but it is a common condition. And in a place like Aberdeen, we don't really have public transportation. but you're still expected to show up to your probation meetings. You're supposed to maintain your job. You're supposed to be contributing to child support if that's something you have to do. You may need to be participating in programming, and you have to do all of those things without transportation. I'm going to steal that assignment idea, by the way. That's a great one. But it's one of the things that has been most surprising for me to learn in sort of the past few years of doing this work is that actually about a quarter of the people incarcerated in the United States are not incarcerated for the crime that they committed. They're incarcerated because of a violation of community supervision. It's not a criminal offense a new criminal offense that brought them back into prison or jail, and they're not sitting there for a new criminal offense. They're sitting there for a violation of probation or parole. There was a really interesting study out of New York that found that recidivism rates were actually pretty equal for people who were essentially just discharged from prison and those who were put out on parole. Pretty much equal likelihood to reoffend and be sent back to prison. Reoffend, not recidivism. Sorry, I need to differentiate there. The reoffense rate was about the same. However, the rearrest rate and the reincarceration rate for those who were on parole was much higher. So parole, which we'd hope would help people transition back into society successfully, was actually a risk factor for reincarceration versus those who were just discharged back into the community. And again, there was no evidence to suggest that they were more likely to commit a crime. It's just because of those conditions that get put on top of you as you're working to reintegrate, and you can be sent back to prison for having a beer, something that'd be legal for pretty much anyone else, right? That it just sets up these conditions that people are reincarcerated.
Thank you for that. Now we're going to shift the conversation a little bit into, okay, what do we do about it? But first, I want to take a moment and see if anybody, any of our guests, has a question, comment, concern. What do you guys have to say?
Is this the point where I get to ask a question?
Go for it.
Okay, I put my question in the chat. I could read it, or somebody could read it. This is John Holt with South Dakota Searchlight, by the way.
Hi, John. Thanks for joining us. Oh, I see it. If you want, I can read it, or you could just have that.
Yeah, I could read it too. Yeah, so our unquestionably outsized prison population has bounced around a little bit, spiking in 2017, which is something I remember writing about years ago. But it kind of stopped peaking at higher levels about 17 years ago. Governor Dennis Dugard sort of famously predicted a prison population of 4,500 by 2022. That didn't happen because, in part, I'm sure, because we passed criminal justice reform, but we never reduced our population, basically. I guess I'm wondering if there's any chance the panelists could expand on criminal justice reform, what works, what doesn't. Is it as simple as following through, which Professor Borseth said we don't do? I mean, are there examples where it actually does reduce the population? I mean, what works and what doesn't? And yeah, I guess that's the main question. We did it, but nothing really, but the thing that we wanted to happen didn't happen, basically. So what are we missing, and what should we be thinking about?
Thank you for that question, John, because that's actually what we were going to talk about coming up next. There's actually another question in the chat. Jackie wants to know, do women have different needs in reentry? What does that look like in South Dakota?
A couple of things that I would throw out that are more unique to women than men. And it's not to say that men don't have these needs or these issues. It's to say that it's a much higher need among women. One is the separation from children. We know that women incarcerated are much more likely to be primary caregivers for dependent children than their male counterparts. So we also know that those relationships hold a very significant value to these women who are incarcerated. And relationships tend to have a very profound impact on incarcerated women because women's prisons tend to be located in much more rural communities. And so if you are a woman incarcerated, you are likely farther from your family than if you are male incarcerated, both because of the location of the prison and then there's just generally fewer women's prisons. So women have a much higher need to focus on how do we reunite these families? How do we get them access to these children again? What are the steps that they need to take, and how can we do that safely? women also tend to co-offend a lot more often. So there are more concerns about male influences on formerly incarcerated women and what those significant others are doing and how those relationships work and if they're healthy and safe. And then just getting out of prison, right? Getting back home when you're in a rural community and you have to travel across the state to get home and you're given like $30 to do so, that can be very difficult. So those are the three that I would probably highlight, but there's probably a lot more that I'm not thinking of immediately.
Okay, thank you. I think we might as well just go right on ahead and jump into John's question, because that was what I was hoping we'd talk about next anyway, programming. And that's really the focus of kind of what I wanted to dig into most here. But I want to start with kind of just a brief synopsis of how we got here, Lucas. How did penology start? Like how did we go from how it started to where we are now?
Yeah. I really appreciate the big questions. This is a really important topic. And I guess I would start off by saying that when in this sort of colonial era, right, if we're going to go all the way back, we didn't actually start off with having prisons. So prisons were something that had to be invented along the way. And so initially, our criminal justice system was deeply entwined with sort of religious and moral codes, and punishment was primarily aimed at public deterrence, right? And retribution. So you'd commonly see things like public shaming. So stockades, you've seen pictures like with their feet locked up in public spaces, or pillories where they've got their arms and their heads sort of in this clamshell device. We'd also see things like corporal punishment, whipping, branding, mutilation, and then execution for more serious crimes. And these things would happen publicly. And the idea would be that if you punish people publicly, that's how you deter people from committing crimes in the future. But then sort of in the 1700s, we had a period of enlightenment, which really informed some of the leading minds here in the United States. And we began to believe that people who committed crime, maybe they could be reformed, that maybe we didn't just have to punish them to deter crime from happening, but that we could do things to bring people back in. And this was the beginning of penological rehabilitation. So, and the rise of the penitentiary. This is where we see our first penitentiaries. And if we just think about that word, penitence, it's a place where you can make repentance for crimes that you've committed. That was the original idea for these places. And without getting into too much detail, the way that these places initially emerged, their initial formulations were as essentially silent, isolated, labor-driven places, right? The idea was that you would engage in sort of solitude and labor, and through that work you could have repentance, and you would be successful in being rehabilitated if you participated in that. Now, it turned out we also learned during this time that isolation is incredibly detrimental to people's mental health. It's a lesson we learned a long, long time ago, the 1820s. We're still putting people in isolation today. So that sort of adapted into, there were places where you were isolated at night, but during the day you'd be working with other people. We also realized during this time that, hey, there's an economic benefit to having people in these places and having them do labor and not having to compensate them for it. And that really expanded post-Civil War. So in the North, industrial prisons really expanded. And economic concerns took precedence over rehabilitation. So prisons were really just plugged into our economic machine. And in the South, there was a newfound interest in strictly enforcing petty laws as they were related to the formerly enslaved. So Black folks were routinely arrested and convicted of things like loitering and vagrancy, and then given prison sentences. And they'd be entered into a system of convict leasing, where essentially they would be leased back to the same companies and landowners that ran the plantations and mines that they were enslaved in just a few years or decades earlier. And just convict leasing actually didn't end in the United States until 1941, as sort of an interesting aside there. But labor was really driving this cheap labor is really what drove the development of our prison system from the 1860s to the 1900s. We then did have a progressive era from about the 1900s to the 1920s. And this was a push again for rehabilitative penology, arguing that criminality is the product of poor social conditions and not the inherent evil of those who are committing crimes. And we saw some really important sort of cultural developments during that time. One was that we started viewing juveniles as different from adults for the purposes of corrections. So we in 1899, the first juvenile court system started in Illinois, and it's sort of expanded and changed quite a lot since then, but that's for a different meeting. We also saw the advent of what's called indeterminate sentencing, which is actually where the birth of parole comes from, right? So historically, you can either get a determinate sentence, you get a 10-year sentence, right? And depending on the circumstances and where we are in history, you'd serve some proportion of that and maybe get some time off for good time. In indeterminate sentences, I'm giving you 10 years to 25 years, and you'll serve some amount of time between those two amounts. And it's up to the parole board to decide when you're eligible to re-enter the community. The idea was, how can the judge know at the time of sentencing when you're going to be rehabilitated? If that is our objective, to rehabilitate you, we need another group of people to look at your time of corrections, your incarceral time, and decide when it amounts to enough of a change to be able to re-enter. So that happened there as well. It was also the beginning of educational vocational training programs in prison. These ideas sort of continued in sort of the first half of the 20th century. This is when we started referring to these places as correctional institutions. So it's about correcting, about expanding prisoner education and psychology programs. We developed this sort of medical view of crime, that if you give professionals access to these people, you can treat them for these underlying social or psychological conditions and maybe cure them. And we also began community-based corrections, so probation and parole. However, and I'm sure this is something that Dr. Borseth may have something to say, is during the 1970s, there was this sort of famous report by Robert Mortensen that is referred to as the Nothing Works report, right? And it was a mischaracterization of the research at the time. It's sort of a complex story, but this story sort of swept across the nation, that there was this meta-analysis done, and they determined that all of this work we were doing to rehabilitate people wasn't doing anything. It wasn't helping them. It wasn't hurting them. We were just dumping resources into this work that didn't actually have a material impact. It turns out, again, that was a misrepresentation of the research, but the way that politics works, right, it doesn't really matter what actually the research says. It matters what people think the research says. So we saw this period of great contraction in terms of actually working towards rehabilitate people in prison, this turn towards punishment that really exploded during the tough on crime era in the 1980s and 1990s, where we had all sorts of legislation passed that aimed, again, back on deterrence, deterring the public from committing crimes by using swift and severe sanctioning. As it turns out, doesn't really work very well, but that was the thought of the time. And we saw these huge increases in mass incarceration, so the rates of people being incarcerated. It was about five-fold increase from 1970 to 2008 in terms of people incarcerated. But at the same time, we also saw an explosion of what is known as mass supervision. So people being put into probation and parole. That increased by about 4 times during that same period. So we had this parallel. We talk a lot about mass incarceration. We don't talk as much about mass supervision. But as we've discussed so far, mass supervision actually drives mass incarceration as well, because when you're put into probation or parole, your likelihood of going to prison goes way up at those stages. So that essentially gets us to the 2000s, where we are sort of in a little bit of a tug of war at the moment in terms of reducing incarceration and being harsher in our approach on crime, right? We're sort of at a pivot point here, it seems, in terms of what we're going to do next. There have been some minor reductions in incarceration rates since about 2008. But as I said a little bit earlier, it's unclear which way things are trending exactly at this moment.
Thank you for that. So the answer to what we need to do then involves programming. What goes on while these people are incarcerated to, decrease the recidivism rate and things like that. There are a couple questions in the chat. And hi, Lawrence, I see your question, and that's going to be I'll get back to that. But Tara has a question. How much time out of an incarcerated person's day is spent focused on the rehabilitation? Is it one-on-one and adapted for that person, or is it in a group format?
Difficult to give you a percentage or hour of an inmate's time that's spent on rehabilitation. The second question is a little bit easier in that it's typically group format. There's not a lot of one-on-one treatment efforts happening. The reason the first question is a little bit hard to answer is, one, it can vary throughout an inmate's stay. So a lot of programming that we offer in institutions, inmates opt into, they're not required to do it. So if an inmate isn't seeking out opportunities, they're going to be enrolled in less programming. There are also set a number of seats in these classes. So for example, South Dakota offers, I think it's Thinking for a Change is the one that their prisons offer. That's usually capped at around like 20 to 25 participants at a time. So once you hit that cap, that is full. You cannot accommodate more people. If you put in more people, we know it's going to be less effective. So there's a lot of restrictions on that. And then when we think about like sanctions given for behavioral infractions while incarcerated, those inmates, often what they lose access to is rehabilitative programming. So they're locked into a cell more of the time, not allowing them to seek that programming. So I don't know how to answer the first part of the question. I'm sorry.
And because we are running short on time, I want to jump into what types of programming in your research, Jenna, have Dr. Borseth have shown to be effective? Because there's lots of options out there, but what do we know from the research that is effective?
So types of programming that are effective, cognitive behavioral based programs are very effective. Behavioral programs can be very effective. The problem with leaving the answer at that is that there are programs that market themselves as being cognitive behavioral, and they're not. So having the label of CBT written in your program doesn't make it effective. I'll also say that I wish it were that straightforward, because just adopting CBT programming isn't enough. There's tons of other stipulations to meet that we know will help breed effective outcomes. For example, we know we need to assess offender risk and needs. We know we need to recommend them to individualized programming. Typically, this programming needs to be focused on high-risk offenders, which means that opt-in model that we have where offenders volunteer themselves to participate in programming might not be very effective, because if you're a low-risk person, you don't need to be taking up one of those 25 Thinking for a Change spots, because even though I know you would like the programming, we know you're not going to benefit as much as a high-risk person. We also know things like, we already talked a little bit about this, ongoing employment needs. And how difficult it can be to get a job. A lot of prisons provide work opportunities. Some provide certificates to be able to practice better jobs. We talked, for example, in South Dakota, working in the field of electric work, working as an electrician. Some states train inmates to become firefighters. Some states train inmates to become barbers. And those certificates are great in that they provide jobs while you're incarcerated. But if we don't allow inmates to hold those positions outside of the prison institution, it's largely meaningless. For example, when I talk about firefighting positions, California notoriously uses a lot of inmate labor to work, to manage fires. It wasn't until I think like 8 years ago where inmates were actually allowed to work as firefighters post-incarceration. So when we have programs like that, we need to make sure that they're going to be, useful in the long run. Similarly, we talked about fractured relationships, right? We don't have a ton of programs and opportunities that focus on maintaining those inmate connections with families. One of the questions, and I don't have a perfect answer for your question. Who was that, Lawrence? One of the things, though, that fits neatly into this conversation is that North Dakota does have more extensive programming available. So for example, they ran programs before where they do like reading story times, where offenders can get a book, they can record themselves reading it, and then that book and audio tape goes to their family so their children can still have that bonding, even when they can't regularly visit. So there's a lot that goes into rehabilitation beyond just what types of programming. The last bit I'll throw out before, I know we're running low on time, but this piece often gets missed, is we have this laundry list of these are the things that we know we should be doing in order for things to run smoothly and to reduce recidivism rates. The thing that often gets missed is we can't just throw that into our prison facilities and expect perfect outcomes. We still need to be assessing it. We still need to be making sure that when we have evidence-based programming, like Thinking for a Change, we're bringing professionals in and making sure these are run like they're supposed to be run and they're having the impacts that we want them to have on our inmates.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. So South Dakota has adopted recently, it's called SAFER SD, it's Reentry Initiative. And I somewhere in my notes here is what SAFER stands for, and I apologize, I don't have it right here in front of me. But from Department of Correction statistics, between 100 and 200 inmates get their GED every year. And there's career technical education offered, but there's only three facilities of the 8 that offer it, and they are in Rapid City Minimum Center, Yankton Minimum Center, and Mike Durkee State Prison in Springfield, which common factor there is those are all low level, they're low level, low level security. That's what I'm thinking. And so it kind of goes back to the question of what you were just saying, Jenna, is, providing spots to those that are least likely to reoffend, because in these programs that are available, it looks like there's 12 slots available at each one. That's 36 slots for 3,000 inmates, and there aren't any in the women's prison. There's nothing right now in the women's prison. So what do you think is going to be a determinant factor in whether any type of initiative that we adopt in South Dakota is going to be successful without increased programming for everybody, not just for, specific level of offenders, specific offenses like substance or alcohol related? What's going to make the difference?
I'm not sure that I fully followed your question. So you're saying with like a minor reform and not increasing the general availability of programming?
Right. Like it seems to me that it needs to be on a little bit of a grander scale. Not just the CTE programs available for 36 inmates, or the offering of the GED. What else do we need to be looking at that, in terms of mental health capabilities, that kind of programming? What else needs to be done?
That's a really difficult question, because what I would say is if we want to effectively manage this problem, we shouldn't be just looking at the prisons. This takes prevention efforts, right? Improving our educational system, reducing our poverty rate, having adequate health care accessibility, whether that's mental health care, physical health care, adequate child care. All of those things will help us reduce the crime rate from the get-go. Then we need to look at the policing, right? How do we divert people from the criminal justice system? That means identifying people who have mental health issues and sending them into mental health professional care, not the justice system. It takes looking at the court system and how we sentence people, right? Expanding diversionary programs, because honestly, when we get to the prison state, there's already so much that has gone wrong. It's very difficult to manage these people. If we can do what we can to deal with them in the community, we're going to be able to rehabilitate much more efficiently. I know that didn't exactly answer your question about what to do in the prison facility. I think it's so important to acknowledge that this isn't just a prison issue. We have inmates, we have a ton of unmet needs in our prisons, but that's not the driver of the problem.
Yeah, and I apologize that my question was a little vague because it's kind of a bunch of questions that I guess combined into one because we are running short of time.
Yeah.
And because we are running out short of time, I wanted to open it up one last time. We got, it looks like 3 or 4 minutes left for any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions.
You talked about isolation within the prison was one of the things, but I think South Dakota as a whole might feel isolating to a lot of people, and the lack of resources within and without, within our state, and how that needs to be improved. Like you said, that it's not a prison issue. So this is more a comment, not a question, but I think as far as the state and what needs to be done, that there needs to be more resources, more educated people. There's such a lack, especially being where I'm at in a population of 1,200 people, and the amount of people with mental health issues and the lack of people that can address that, or if it is crisis situation. So I just think that South Dakota needs to do better and focus some energies in that, and getting more of the professionals that we need into the state, some kind of a program for trying to get them brought in, and incentive for coming here, that would be helpful. Some other form of, funneling your money into getting the people here to help before it gets to that escalated situation where people are going to be incarcerated. So
I think you're right on the spot there, Tara, because ultimately all of this comes down to we're going to need more people. We're going to need more staffing. We're going to need more training. We're going to need, retention of the staff that we do attract and bring in, and that's probably the crucial piece. So that's got to have to be the starting point, I'm assuming, right? Before we can even hope to have the programming that we need the staff available, the people, boots on the ground, as they say, to make that happen.
I will say the legislature has demonstrated they're willing to spend money on criminal justice, clearly. It's just where we're going to spend that money and have it be the most effective. For all the reasons we've discussed today, prisons are what are called criminogenic. That means they actually produce more crime in society. They don't reduce crime. So if our interest is in reducing crime, our resources are much better allocated towards, as Jenna was saying, dealing with some of those earlier stages of those problems to prevent it from even getting to that phase in the first place.
And that is the perfect ending statement, because I think that wraps it all up for us, Dr. Wiscons, because in a nutshell, there's no easy Band-Aid type, solution for the situation. And maybe, we'll have to revisit this conversation again in another Humanities Cafe episode, because there's a lot to talk about. But it is the end of the lunch hour, so we're going to close up for today. I do, excuse me, want to thank you all for joining us. Invite you to join us again in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about Lakota Star Knowledge with Dr. Craig Howe and Caitlin Bordeaux, and how that Lakota Star Knowledge is being used by organizations like NASA and other developments for STEM education. So it'll be another interesting topic, I promise. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful, nice, warm spring day. And thank you, Dr. Wiscons. Thank you, Dr. Borseth. We have learned so much, and I appreciate your participation. Thank you. Everybody have a good day. Bye-bye.